This now takes us into part 3 of the history of God, and we left off basically at the end of the Babylonian era, after the basic destruction of the first great civilizations. This now takes us into a new age. Of course, learning from the mistakes of the first civilizations, newer and more powerful civilizations were born, and thus we enter the time of Egyptians. Unlike those who came before, the Egyptians learnt that the gods needed to be seen as more powerful and less connected to the people. Thus, the gods of Egypt were made to have the heads of various animals, and thus ensuring distinction and also showing homage to nature, which the people were dependent upon. Without nature on their side, the people wouldn't be able to survive, and survival was still key at this point. At the same time, to ensure the high place of the rulers, they were now seen as actual living gods, not just chosen of God. Thus, when a ruler died, they would take their place next to the other gods, forever. The priests also ensured their place by changing beliefs to ensure the people had no choice but to require their services. Before, the idea of getting to the afterlife was assured by one's actions. Now, it required the blessing of the priests. Without their blessing, the unfortunate person would be doomed to eternal torment and pain. Thus, the only way to ensure a happy afterlife was to keep the priests on your side, which usually consisted of large contributions in exchange for their hallowed services. At the same time, the priests were bound to the will of the ruler, the pharaoh. Without his personal blessing and support, the priests were nothing. In fact, the high priests of the main gods were all appointed by the pharaoh directly. Since he was seen as a living god, his will meant more than that of the other gods. Before this, the priests and rulers had a balance of power. Now, the pharaoh had most of it, though the priests still had a significant share of their own. At the same time, to show the prosperity of this great civilization, the pharaohs commissioned massive structures to commemorate the various gods. These structures were a clear symbol of the power and might of the godly pharaohs. The bigger the structure, the greater the glory and power the pharaoh had. Because the civilization prospered and the people were mostly happy in their new roles, they would willingly assist in the creation of these great structures. To be able to help build these monuments was actually seen as a great honor for the average person. Of course, when more people were needed, there were also slaves. Thus, the civilization flourished by ensuring that people needed the gods, both living and otherwise, by ensuring everyone knew how strong and prosperous the civilization was, and by ensuring the civilization remained prosperous by eliminating or converting all enemies. Everyone and everything basically thrived. During the span of this great civilization, different gods became dominant. Different groups also ruled in whatever manner they chose, some less beneficial to the people than others. However, in it all, the new pharaoh was always seen as a living god, and the people believed that they needed this god. In the middle of all the upheavals that were actually quite common during this time, there was a small group of slaves that had a different idea on how things should be. They didn't believe in a number of gods, they believed simply in one, the all-powerful god that they worshipped, in their view, was more powerful than all the other gods put together. Since they were slaves, they didn't have total freedom. However, slaves in those days were very different than what slaves were in more modern times. They had the freedom to worship this one god, just not the ability to direct their own lives. They were directed by their masters on what to do and when to do it. Over time, this group of slaves found a means to escape their bondage and went deep into the desert to find freedom. There they roamed for many years looking for a place they could call their own. By this time, they had all been born slaves and had no true homeland of their own to go back to, and thus they wandered. During this time of trial and tribulation, they honed their beliefs in their one true God. They shaped their beliefs by what occurred during this time, molding it to meet their needs and keep the people together and full of hope. Like others here too, some people became priests in order to lead the people to freedom. Learning from their masters, they had discovered the great power of the priest and had adopted the role to meet their own needs. These were the people who the rest turned to for comfort and support during these harsh times. These priests were the people who tried their best to keep the people moving forward and together and whatnot. Over a significant span of time, this group finally did find a place to call their own and began to spread their new beliefs to anyone who would listen. They didn't grow into a great empire at this point in history. In fact, they were merely another of many small groups that existed at the same time. So now we jump forward a little bit in time and enter a new era. Eventually, the great civilization of Egypt was conquered by a distant people from another land, and thus we enter the time of Greco-Romans. Like the Egyptians, the Greco-Romans believed in many gods. However, like those who came before, their gods were still connected to the people. They looked just like the people, acted like them, and lived lives very similar to them, except for the fact they were gods. In most other ways, the gods were essentially people. Like the other peoples, there were rulers, priests, and many others. However, what separated these people was that the gods were important in life instead of being tied exclusively to life. This meant that the gods didn't dictate the people's lives, but merely had the ability to influence it when there was a need to. Another major difference was that the rulers were more often a group of people made up of people, instead of simply being one person chosen by the gods. In fact, in this society, exceptional ability in some field or other was generally seen as a mark of favor by the gods, not simply some great feat due to their birth. This was the first civilization in history to be ruled by the people. Of course, there often was just one person in charge of it all, chosen by the others to be their leader. This person was called the emperor, for they had created an empire, though at times there was a more traditional ruler, someone who would deny the conventions of the day and seize control of the empire. Like before, when this occurred, the descendants of the conqueror were those who became the ruler in their time. Some were great leaders and some were tyrants, yet most of the time the people retained a voice. Even when there was a tyrant on the throne, the people still had some say in what happened. They deferred to the ruler. However, they served a useful tool to know the minds, needs, and wants of the people. After all, even a tyrant can be overthrown by the people if they choose to do so. During a large section of this empire's existence, the believers in the one true God and their people didn't really get along. In fact, those who believed in the one God were often fed to the lions, literally, made to participate in ruthless and bloody ordeals purely for the amusement of the masses. In this time, the people of the empire lived very controlled lives. Self-control was seen as a virtue. However, there were special places constructed that allowed the people to release their inner hostility. One of the most notorious was the Colosseum. Here, enemies would be sacrificed for all to see and celebrate the death. The Colosseum was also a place that slaves could win their freedom to become citizens of the empire. To do so, all they had to do was kill those sent to the Colosseum and battle amongst themselves for the spectators, until the emperor noticed them and granted them their freedom for their great achievements and victories. This was the place they would send the believers in the one true God, sent to be executed for the enjoyment of the masses. However, sometime later in the history of this great empire, one ruler decided, for the first time in the history of the empire, to change gods. The specific reasons for their choice aren't necessarily known. However, the end result was that every person in the empire was required to convert to the belief in the one true God. It was from that point forward that belief in this new God became the dominant belief system of the day. The most powerful nation of that time now began to worship God. Then they began to spread the religion to others. By this time, the beliefs had been tempered by many generations of people and had taken on a form much broader than what was there when the slaves first left Egypt. And that will stop there and conclude the end of part 3, and we'll pick it up again in part 4. Stay tuned.